Steve Marriott had one of the greatest voices in rock music, the explosive frontman of two legendary bands, Small Faces and Humble Pie. But his life did not end on stage, but in a tragic fire at his home at the age of 44. How could such an extraordinary talent have such a lonely and horrific end? This is the story of a genius exploited by the music industry and consumed by his own demons, a tragedy of a voice that burned too brightly and died too soon. To truly understand Steve Marriott, you have to feel the grit and the soul of the world that forged him. This wasn't the swinging, vibrant city of the 1960s. This was a city shrouded in a gray cloak of austerity, a landscape of bomb sites turned into makeshift playgrounds. But beneath that grim, exhausted surface, a new generation was stirring. A generation born in the shadow of war, but desperate for color, for excitement, for an identity that was entirely their own. Stephen Peter Marriott was born into this world in 1947 in East Ham, a working-class corner of London's sprawling East End. This was a world of terraced houses packed tightly together, of smoky pubs on every corner, and a fierce, insular sense of community. His father, Bill, was a print worker, a classic East End character with a quick, dry wit and a deep love for the old-time music hall songs of a bygone era. His mother, Kay, was the real driving force in the family, a woman of immense energy and ambition who saw a unique spark in her only son and was utterly determined to fan it into a raging flame. The Marriotts weren't destitute, but their world was a million miles away from the posh, privileged backgrounds of many rock stars who would come later. Steve's roots were unapologetically, authentically working class, and that authenticity would become his greatest artistic weapon. Growing up, he was a whirlwind of energy, a tiny kid with a personality that filled every room he entered. He was a natural performer, a born show-off who would do anything for a laugh or a round of applause. His father encouraged his musicality, teaching him the old Cockney songs on a ukulele, while his mother saw something more. She saw a star. While other kids were kicking a football around the streets, Kay enrolled Steve in a local stage school. It was her dream to see him escape the drudgery of a 9-to-5 life, to achieve a level of fame and success she could only imagine, and she got her wish remarkably quickly. At the tender age of 12, Steve Marriott became a professional. He landed the coveted role of the artful Dodger in a major West End production of Lionel Bart's smash hit musical Oliver. It was the perfect role for him. The Dodger was the quintessential London character, cheeky, charming, resilient, a survivor. Steve didn't just have to act the part, he was the part. He was channeling the very spirit of the streets he grew up on. He even got to sing a few numbers. And it was here, on the grand stage of the new theater, that his voice, that incredible, raw, soulful instrument, was first showcased to a wide audience. He was a child star, but not in the glossy, protected Hollywood sense. He was a working actor, earning his keep, contributing a man's wage to the family income. But this early brush with fame came with a harsh lesson that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He later claimed that his father took almost all of his earnings, spending them lavishly. Whether it was naivety or something more cynical, this experience planted a seed of deep mistrust in Steve. It was his first taste of how the money you earn with your own talent can so easily disappear into other people's pockets. It was a pattern that would repeat itself with devastating consequences. But as the 1950s gave way to the early 60s, the world outside the theater was changing. A new youth cult was bubbling up from the underground, born in the smoky coffee bars and jazz clubs of Soho. They called themselves the Mods. This wasn't just a fashion trend. It was a way of life. It was a movement built on immaculately sharp suits, Italian scooters adorned with dozens of mirrors, and an obsessive, almost forensic attention to detail. Above all, it was built on music. The mods worshipped the raw, visceral sounds of American rhythm and blues. Artists like Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, John Lee Hooker, and Ray Charles. This was the music that spoke to them, music with a raw emotional power that was a million miles away from the bland, manufactured pop that dominated the British charts. For a kid like Steve Marriott, this was a lightning bolt. He fell head over heels in love with R&B. He spent every penny he had on imported records from America, studying the vocal phrasing of his heroes, trying to emulate their raw, guttural sound. He taught himself to play the guitar and the harmonica, pouring all his energy into becoming a genuine musician. The stage school kid was dead, a bluesman was being born. He formed a band, The Moments, and started playing in the small, sweaty clubs that were the crucibles of this new scene. This was where he belonged. The mod scene was fundamentally aspirational. It was about working-class kids creating their own form of elegance, their own aristocracy of cool. And Steve Marriott, with his East End swagger, his obsession with sharp clothes, and his bottomless passion for American soul music, was its perfect embodiment. He may have been short in stature, standing barely 5'4", but on stage he was a giant. He had a charisma that was simply impossible to ignore. And then there was that voice. When Steve Marriott opened his mouth to sing the blues, the effect was nothing short of electrifying. Audiences were stunned. They couldn't believe that this sound, this raw, primal scream of adult emotion, was coming from this tiny, chirpy Cockney kid. He wasn't just imitating his heroes. He was channeling them, filtering their pain and passion through his own unique London experience. The foundations for what would become one of the greatest British bands of the decade were being laid, not in a professional rehearsal room, but in the heart of a cultural revolution that was about to take over the world. The story of how the Small Faces came together is pure rock and roll mythology, a perfect snapshot of a time when destiny seemed to be forged in chance encounters. The year was 1965, and Steve Marriott was working behind the counter at the J60 Music Bar in Manor Park, a job that barely paid the bills but kept him surrounded by the instruments he loved. He was biding his time, playing gigs with his band, but he was restless, itching for something more. One fateful day, two other likely lads from the neighborhood, Ronnie Lane and Kenny Jones, walked into the shop. Lane, a thoughtful melodic bass player with a knack for a catchy tune, and Jones, a powerhouse drummer with an explosive style, were looking to buy a bass. They recognized Marriott from the local scene. They knew he was the real deal. But the true catalyst for the band's formation wasn't a planned jam session. It was a moment of pure, chaotic frustration. Marriott's current band was playing a gig at a local pub. He was fed up with them, feeling they couldn't match his volcanic energy or his passion for authentic R&B. In a fit of theatrical pique, he smashed the piano he was playing and stormed off the stage in the middle of the set. As it happened, Ronnie Lane and Kenny Jones were in the audience that night. They watched this explosion of raw, untamed energy, and they knew right then and there that this was the frontman they needed. They approached him, and in that moment, the Small Faces were essentially born. They quickly recruited a keyboard player, Jimmy Winston, and started rehearsing in the back room of a pub. Their name was a perfect encapsulation of what they were. In mod slang, a face was a leader, a trendsetter, a somebody. And they were famously all small in stature, particularly Marriott. The name was a classic piece of self-deprecating London wit, but it also hinted at the size of their ambition. They wanted to be the biggest faces on the entire scene. and it happened with breathtaking speed. They landed a residency at the Cavern Club in Leicester Square, a legendary mod hangout that was the epicenter of their world. Their live shows were nothing short of explosive. They were a hurricane of energy, a tight, powerful unit playing a blistering mix of American R&B covers and their own increasingly confident original songs. At the center of it all was Marriott. He was a dervish on stage, leaping, dancing, pouring every single ounce of his being into every note. And that voice, it was a force of nature. It was raw, soulful, and utterly, totally authentic. In a scene that valued authenticity above all else, Steve Marriott was the genuine article. It didn't take long for the sharks of the music industry to start circling. They were spotted by a manager who was already a legend in the business, for all the wrong reasons. Don Arden. Arden was a larger-than-life character, a hard-nosed, intimidating businessman with a reputation for violence and shady dealings. He was known, with a mixture of fear and awe, as the Al Capone of pop. He saw the small faces, and he didn't just see talent, he saw a gold mine. He signed them on the spot, got them a record deal with Decca Records, and shoved them into the studio. Their first hit, What You Gonna Do About It, was a slice of pure adrenaline-fueled mod rock. It was built around a classic R&B riff, famously borrowed from a Solomon Burke song, and driven by Marriott's ferocious, snarling vocal. It was an instant anthem for the mod generation, a 2.5-minute statement of defiance and youthful rebellion. The song shot up the charts, and suddenly the small faces were genuine pop stars. What followed was a relentless whirlwind of chart success, television appearances on shows like Ready, Steady, Go, and the constant scream of adoring fans. They became fashion icons, their sharp suits, distinctive haircuts, and cocksure attitudes copied by kids all over the country. They were, without a doubt, the ultimate mod band, the living, breathing embodiment of the entire scene. They rattled off a string of hits, Sha-La-La-La-Lee, Hey Girl, and the towering, emotionally charged ballad, All or Nothing. The latter showcased a different side of Marriott's voice. It wasn't just about shouting and screaming. He could be tender, vulnerable, and heartbreakingly soulful. All or Nothing went straight to #1 in the UK charts. The small faces were on top of the world, but behind the scenes, the cracks were already beginning to show. Jimmy Winston was replaced on keyboards by the supremely talented and equally diminutive Ian McLagan, cementing the band's classic lineup. But the pressures of fame were immense. They were living the life, the parties, the clothes, the adoration, but they were also working relentlessly, trapped in a brutal cycle of touring, recording, and promotion. And then there was the money, or, more accurately, the complete lack of it. Despite their phenomenal success, the band members were seeing virtually no cash. Don Arden had them on a wage of £20 a week each, plus an account at a trendy London boutique to keep them looking the part. They were selling millions of records. Their faces were on every teen magazine, but they were being treated like employees. Arden, along with their own parents, controlled all the finances. The band, young and naive in the ways of the business world, had signed a contract that essentially handed over all their earnings. It was a classic, tragic tale of rock and roll exploitation, but for the small faces, it was a particularly bitter pill to swallow. They were the voice of a generation, yet they couldn't afford to move out of their parents' houses. The frustration and disillusionment began to seep into their music and their lives. They had a famous and possibly apocryphal confrontation with Arden, which ended with them parting ways. They left Decca and signed with Andrew Loog Oldham's Immediate Records. Oldham was the enigmatic manager of the Rolling Stones, a hipper, more artist-friendly figure. He promised them creative freedom and, for the first time, unlimited studio time. This was a turning point. The band, particularly the formidable songwriting partnership of Marriott and Ronnie Lane began to experiment. The year was 1967. The mod scene was fading, giving way to the psychedelic explosion of the summer of love. The Small Faces, always a perfect reflection of the times, evolved with it. Their music became more complex, more introspective, more weird. This new direction culminated in their undisputed masterpiece, the 1968 concept album, Ogden's Nut Gone Flake. Ogden's was a landmark album, a whimsical, uniquely British psychedelic journey, packaged in a circular tin designed to look like a tobacco tin. Side 1 was a collection of brilliant, sharply written songs that blended rock, soul, and music, Hall influences. Side 2 was a full-blown fairy tale, Happiness Stan, about a boy's quest to find the missing half of the moon, narrated in his signature gobbledygook style by the absurdist comedian Stanley Unwin. It was ambitious, it was eccentric, and it was utterly brilliant. The album was a massive critical and commercial success, hitting #1 in the UK, and it also spawned their most famous single, the classic Lazy Sunday, a jaunty music hall-inflected song about a row with the neighbors, complete with Marriott singing in an exaggerated, almost cartoonish Cockney accent. Lazy Sunday was a huge hit, but ironically, it was also the beginning of the end. Marriott despised the song's novelty success. He was a serious musician, a soul singer at heart, and he felt the song turned them into a joke, a cheeky music hall act. It was a source of immense frustration for him. He wanted to be seen as a credible heavyweight artist like his heroes, not as a purveyor of quirky pop tunes. The very thing that made them bigger than ever was, in his mind, destroying their credibility. The band was also struggling to replicate the complex layered sound of Ogden's on stage. They were a 4-piece rock and roll band, not an orchestra with a full-time narrator. The creative tension that had produced such brilliant music was now pulling them apart. Marriott, in particular, was growing increasingly restless. He was listening to the heavier, more guitar-oriented sounds coming from bands like Peter Green's Fleetwood Mac and the Jeff Beck Group. He was drawn to that power, that freedom. He wanted to rock. Ronnie Lane, on the other hand, was heading in a more pastoral, folk-influenced, and spiritually inclined direction. Their musical paths were diverging at an alarming rate. The final straw came during a disastrous New Year's Eve gig in 1968 at Alexandra Palace. Marriott, fueled by frustration, alcohol, and who knows what else, was in a foul mood. He wasn't connecting with the music or the audience. Halfway through a song, he famously threw his guitar down on the stage and walked off, shouting to the stunned crowd, "I'm off!" And that was it. Just like that, the Small Faces, one of the most beloved and influential British bands of the 1960s, were over. For Steve Marriott, it felt like a liberation. He was free from the pop star image he had grown to despise, free from the creative compromises, free to pursue his ultimate dream of being a serious, hard-rocking blues guitarist and singer. He had already found the man he wanted to start this new chapter with, a young, unknown guitar prodigy named Peter Frampton. The dream was to form a supergroup, a band that would be heavier, louder, and more musically adventurous than anything he had done before. The name of that band would be Humble Pie. He had no idea that this new beginning would set him on a path to incredible superstardom in America, but also to a deeper, more dangerous level of excess and disillusionment that would ultimately lead to his tragic downfall. With the Small Faces in his rearview mirror, Steve Marriott was a man possessed by a new musical vision. He wanted to create a band that would shed the pop sensibilities and whimsical psychedelia of his past and embrace a raw, blues-drenched, twin guitar-heavy sound. He wanted to create a British band that could stand shoulder to shoulder with the giants of the burgeoning hard rock scene, like Led Zeppelin and Cream, and he found his perfect foil in Peter Frampton. Frampton was at the time the golden boy of the British music scene. He was stunningly handsome and a prodigiously talented guitarist who had just left his own successful pop band, The Herd, where he was marketed as the face of 68. While Frampton was known for his pretty boy image, he was a serious musician with a deep and abiding love for the blues. The combination of Marriott's raw, soulful vocal power and Frampton's fluid, melodic, and technically brilliant guitar playing seemed like a match made in rock and roll heaven. They quickly recruited Greg Ridley, a powerhouse bass player from the respected band Spooky Tooth, and a 17-year-old drumming prodigy named Jerry Shirley. They called themselves Humble Pie. The name was Marriott's idea, a typically self-deprecating joke. He was tired of being a face, a pop star. He wanted the music, and only the music, to do the talking. Their first two albums for Andrew Loog Oldham's collapsing immediate label, As Safe as Yesterday Is, and Town and Country, were a fascinating and eclectic blend of styles. They showcased the band's incredible musical dexterity, veering from heavy bone-crushing blues rock to gentle pastoral acoustic folk. But Immediate Records was in its death throes, and the band felt they weren't getting the support or the direction they needed. They needed a manager who could see their true potential and break them in the biggest, most lucrative market in the world, America. They found that man in D. Anthony. Anthony was a tough, no-nonsense American manager, a quintessential New York hustler who had previously worked with artists like Tony Bennett and Jerry Vale. He saw the incredible untapped potential in Humble Pie, particularly in their incendiary live show. He signed them to A&M Records in the U.S. and laid out a simple, brutal, but effective strategy: tour America relentlessly, playing every town, big or small, until they were the biggest band in the country. And so began the great assault on America. Humble Pie became a touring machine, crisscrossing the United States in a van, playing every club, theater, and college gymnasium that would have them. Their live shows quickly became the stuff of legend. They were a visceral, sweat-drenched explosion of pure energy. Marriott, finally freed from the constraints of being a pop frontman, was in his absolute element. He was a force of nature on stage, a strutting, screaming, blues-wailing dervish who held the audience in the palm of his hand. He would trade blistering guitar solos with Frampton, their twin guitar attack becoming the band's undeniable signature. This was the era of album-oriented rock AOR radio, and Humble Pie's sound was tailor-made for it. Their first two studio albums for A&M, Humble Pie and Rock On, were solid efforts, but it was their reputation as a live act that was truly building their audience. A&M Records wisely decided to capture this lightning in a bottle. In May of 1971, they recorded two shows at the legendary Fillmore East in New York City. The resulting double album, Performance Rockin' the Fillmore, was a game changer. Rockin' the Fillmore is, without exaggeration, one of the greatest live albums of all time. It captured the raw, untamed power of Humble Pie in a way their studio albums never quite had. It was loud, it was loose, and it was utterly electrifying. The album was a massive success, soaring up the U.S. charts and turning them from a respected opening act into a major must-see headliner. They were suddenly superstars in America. The days of the van were over. Now they were flying in private jets, playing to sold-out arenas, and living the life of decadent excess that came with it. But this phenomenal success came at a steep price. The relentless touring schedule and the pressure to maintain their hard-rocking image were taking a heavy toll. The band was awash in alcohol and increasingly drugs, particularly cocaine. Marriott, who had always had a wild streak, embraced the rock star lifestyle with a terrifying gusto. He was the life of the party, a hilarious, generous, and often completely out of control character. But the lifestyle was exacerbating the darker, more volatile sides of his personality. He could be paranoid, prone to fits of destructive rage, and deeply insecure. The musical direction of the band was also becoming a serious source of tension. Marriott, driven by his love for raw R&B and soul, was pushing the band in a heavier, louder, and more vocally dominated direction. Peter Frampton, a more subtle and melodic player and songwriter, felt increasingly sidelined. He had written beautiful acoustic-based songs that were being ignored in favor of Marriott's full-throttle blues rock workouts. The perfect complementary dynamic between the two frontmen was now a source of open conflict. The breaking point came during the recording of their next album, which would become Smokin'. Frampton decided he had had enough. He wanted to pursue a solo career where he could have full creative control over his own music. He left the band just as they were on the cusp of their greatest commercial success. It was a decision that would prove to be a masterstroke for Frampton, who would go on to become one of the biggest stars of the 1970s with his blockbuster album, Frampton Comes Alive. For Humble Pie, it was a devastating, though not immediately fatal blow. They quickly replaced Frampton with the virtuosic but less charismatic guitarist Clem Clemson. The resulting album, Smokin', was a huge commercial success, their biggest to date. It contained the hit single 30 Days in the Hole, a rowdy, infectious anthem about drug busts and bootleg whiskey that perfectly captured their wild reputation. Humble Pie was bigger than ever, but they had lost a key part of their musical soul. Without Frampton's melodic counterpoint, the band became almost solely a vehicle for Marriott's blues rock bombast. The subtlety was gone, replaced by brute force. The next few years were a blur of sold-out tours, platinum albums, and ever-increasing decadence. But the music became formulaic, and the excess became overwhelming. Marriott's drug use was spiraling out of control. His behavior became increasingly erratic and unpredictable. There are infamous stories of him flushing thousands of dollars in cash down a hotel toilet in a fit of paranoia, of starting massive food fights on private jets, of drunkenly challenging people to fights he had no hope of winning. He was a man who seemed to be at war with himself, desperately trying to live up to the larger-than-life, wild man image he had so successfully created. He was also becoming cripplingly paranoid about money. Despite earning millions of dollars, he was convinced he was being ripped off again, just like in the old days. He fell out with their manager, D. Anthony, and the band's finances, which he had never paid close attention to, fell into disarray. By the mid-1970s, the creative well had run dry. The band was exhausted, burned out, and musically stagnant. In 1975, after a farewell tour, Humble Pie officially, and rather quietly, broke up. Steve Marriott returned to England, expecting to settle down and live comfortably off the vast fortune he believed he had amassed. He was in for the shock of his life. He discovered that due to a combination of appalling mismanagement, crooked accounting, his own profligate spending, and a hefty tax bill he knew nothing about, there was very little money left. He was a rock and roll superstar, a man who had sold millions of records and conquered America, and he was, once again, almost broke. The vicious cycle of success and exploitation that had begun with the Small Faces had come full tragic circle. He was back where he started, but this time he was older, more cynical, and carrying the heavy invisible baggage of years of rock and roll excess. The long, slow, painful decline had begun. The late 1970s and 1980s were a difficult and often humbling period for Steve Marriott. The musical landscape had changed beyond recognition. Punk rock had exploded out of London and New York, a raw, aggressive movement that intentionally swept away the perceived excesses and self-indulgence of the 70s rock gods. A new wave of bands had taken over the charts. For a figure like Marriott, a bona fide 60s and 70s rock icon, finding his place in this new world was a constant and often demoralizing struggle. He tried to launch a solo career, but it never really gained traction. He formed a new band, Steve Marriott's All-Stars, which eventually included his old Small Faces bandmate Ian McLagan, but they were largely relegated to playing the pub and club circuit. These were often chaotic, alcohol-fueled gigs, a far, far cry from the sold-out arenas he had commanded with Humble Pie. For a man who had tasted the very pinnacle of rock stardom, this return to the grind was a bitter pill to swallow. His pride was wounded, and he often masked his disappointment with bravado and booze. There were brief, tantalizing moments of hope. In 1980, he reconnected with Jerry Shirley, and they decided to reform Humble Pie. They recorded 2 albums, On to Victory and Go for the Throat. The albums were respectable professional efforts, but they failed to capture the magic or the danger of the band's heyday and didn't make a significant commercial impact. A planned tour was cut short when Marriott, in a moment that perfectly encapsulated his self-destructive tendencies, crushed his hand badly in a hotel door, making it impossible for him to play guitar. It was yet another setback. His personal life was equally tumultuous. He went through a series of relationships and marriages, fathering several children. He was a man who genuinely craved the stability and warmth of a family, but was perpetually drawn to the chaos and transience of the rock and roll life. He was a loving, but often absent father, a man whose good intentions were frequently derailed by his own demons. Throughout this entire period, his financial situation remained precarious, a constant source of stress and anger. The issue of unpaid royalties from his time with both the Small Faces and Humble Pie became a consuming obsession. He spent years battling with record companies and former managers, utterly convinced that he was owed a fortune. The sad, infuriating reality was that the contracts he had signed as a young, naive man were largely ironclad. There was little he could do. This burning sense of injustice gnawed at him, fueling his anger, his paranoia, and his drinking. There was one project that held the promise of a major comeback, a chance to right the wrongs of the past, a full reunion of the original Small Faces. The 4 members had always retained a deep brotherly affection for one another, despite their musical differences. In the late 1980s, there were serious discussions about reforming for a tour and album. A lucrative offer was on the table. It seemed like the perfect opportunity for Marriott to finally get the financial security he craved and to reclaim his legacy on his own terms. But it was not to be. Marriott's erratic behavior, his heavy drinking, and his stubborn insistence on a different musical direction ultimately derailed the reunion before it could even get off the ground. It was a heartbreaking missed opportunity. By the early 1990s, Steve Marriott was living a quiet, almost reclusive life in a 16th century cottage in the picturesque village of Arkesden, Essex. The cottage, named Beehive Cottage, was his pride and joy. It was a piece of old England, a world away from the madness and duplicity of the music business. He was still playing music, of course, often on with a local band called Packet of Three in the pubs around Essex, playing for the sheer love of it. And, most promisingly, he had a new serious project in the works with his old friend Peter Frampton. They had reconnected and begun writing songs together. The old tensions had faded, replaced by a mature respect for each other's talents. The new material was reportedly fantastic. For the first time in a very long time, it seemed like Marriott was in a good place, creatively and personally. He was excited, focused, and looking forward to the future. On the 19th of April, 1991, Marriott and his third wife, Toni, flew back to England from the United States, where he had been working on the new material with Frampton. The couple had dinner with friends that evening. By all accounts, Marriott was in high spirits, laughing, joking, and full of optimism about the new project. But he was also drinking heavily and was known to have been taking cocaine. Later that night, back at Beehive Cottage, an argument broke out between Marriott and his wife. Toni, upset and deeply worried about his intoxicated state, went to stay with friends nearby. Steve Marriott was left alone in the house he loved. What happened in the next few hours is a matter of forensic evidence and tragic, heartbreaking speculation. It is believed that Marriott, drunk and disoriented from the long flight and the argument, fell asleep in bed with a lit cigarette. In the quiet of the quaint cottage, a small cigarette butt became the spark. The fire quickly caught the bedding, spreading with terrifying speed through the ancient wood frame structure of the house. The official cause of death was smoke inhalation, but the most heartbreaking detail revealed by investigators was that he did not die in his sleep. Evidence showed that he woke up and fought for his life, panicked and surrounded by toxic smoke. Firefighters found him on the bedroom floor, just steps from the safety of the door. He had been unable to escape. The news of his death sent shockwaves through the music world. It was a cruel, senseless, and lonely end to a man who had brought joy to so many. The funeral was a heartbreaking affair, attended by his family, his former bandmates from both Small Faces and Humble Pie, and rock and roll luminaries who had been touched by his immense talent. But beyond the grief of his family and close friends, his death sent a wave of grief through his loyal fans. In 1991, without social media, the news spread through radio and music newspapers. For many, the news came as a sudden blow. It was not just the passing of a rock star, it was the loss of a voice that had shaped their youth. Steve Marriott's legacy is defined by one of rock's greatest voices. With Small Faces, he was the voice of the mod generation. With Humble Pie, he laid the foundations for hard rock. His music influenced countless artists and still resonates today. But his story is also a tragic, cautionary tale. It is the story of a genius exploited by the music industry and a man burned by his own self-destruction. He was a pocket rocket who burned too brightly and burned out too soon. Ultimately, though the fire took his life, it could never extinguish his immortal voice.